Hi, I'm Allison.
And I'm Tom.
And today we're going to talk about generations. So, Tom, let's start with baby boomers. You fall into that generation of rebellion, so maybe you could speak from your personal knowledge in life in your own rebellion, but also astrologically when it starts and when it ends.
Yeah, I am the boomer. I'm the old man in the room of the generations we're going to talk about.
You're the generation that doesn't grow old, remember?
Well, we don't think we are, but unfortunately we are.
It happens.
The boomer generation started about the mid-40s and goes to about 1960. And this was the largest number of souls born of a generation, really almost ever. And what was interesting is that we were born with the astrological symbol of Pluto and Leo, because Pluto in its sign will rule like a whole generation's energy. And Leo is the sign of will, strong will. And we were the most willful generation. And our will came into display when we were in our rebellious years in the mid-60s and early 70s.
Burning bras and dancing around fires.
Yes.
All that
I
stuff.
didn't burn a bra, I didn't have one.
A lot of women did, though, and you can tell now.
Yes, yeah. It was a very revolutionary time because of the way we broke all the rules. We said we won't go to the churches of our parents anymore. We were going to listen to rock and roll, brand new style of music. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that was the big thing at that time. And there were so many things that happened in that revolution that we broke the rules that had always been in place. I mean, we even protested the war that was going on in Vietnam. And so this revolution spawned huge changes in our society that have lasted up into the current 50 years. And those changes are the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, and the gay rights movement. And so from us on, things sped up very quickly as we moved into your generation.
Thank you for birth control, by the way.
Yeah, birth control. Again, an empowerment.
Thank you for birth control. We appreciate that.
But that was so new because women had control over their reproductive systems for the very first time. So instead of moms having 8 or 9 kids, because every time they had sex they had a child, they could now control that. And that was part of the women's liberation movement that made enormous changes to a woman's identity in society.
That'd make me abstain.
Yeah, well.
Shop's closed.
So your Generation X and Generation X really runs from the early 60s to the late 70s.
Okay, so it's 80s questionable, or is it 81, or does
80, early 80s, like 81, 82.
Just think all of it is going into millennials.
Millennials after you is like early 80s and then on. We'll get to them and we'll get to the Gen Z generation.
And sometimes there's overlap, and I just want to clear that up for some people because we read a lot of people.
Yes.
And sometimes we'll read somebody that should fall just inside of millennial, but they seem more like a Gen Xer,
yes.
And that can happen with generations in those first 1 or 2 degrees because of their influences around them too.
Yeah, and again, as we talk about generations, we'll say certain generations, like there were a lot of liberals of the boomers. Well, at the time they were, but what's interesting, as they revolted against the system, they were the generation went right back into the system when they got into their adult years, and they went back into the traditional roles of working for jobs for 30 years, getting married, having children.
They said they'd never be their parents.
And we turned right back into them.
Yes.
And we were the last generation to do that, to be honest, because the Gen X generation, especially the women, is when women for the first time en masse who were born at that time were the first generation to be educated at high levels and possibly start their own careers.
That's true, and I can speak as a Gen Xer. My mom had her associate's degree. I got my bachelor's degree, so I went a step further there, and I ended up salary-wise making more than both of my parents. So I was able to get to that place. Fortunately, in my profession, it almost seems as though men have to prove themselves more in my profession than the women, because women are expected to be aligned with mediumship and psychics. So for me, it ended up I don't think it was as hard as if I became the lawyer that I was going to be and was in a courtroom and trying to get up a government structural ladder, But we do live in Arizona too, which is an Aquarian state. And so we have a mutual friend who is high up in the ranks in law enforcement here that is a woman.
Yes.
And so that is wonderful that it's been made possible for us. And I know a lot of the boomer women broke a lot of those glass ceilings. And then a lot of them had traditional roles, then ended up divorced. My mom was one of those. She wanted the traditional role. and then in the early 80s had to figure out how to make a living.
Right. What's interesting is that the Gen X women, as they were the first women, I do readings for them. I mean, I've done all generations, but the Gen X women, when I get readings with them, they're the first generation to have a dual identity. Because women prior to that, aside from boomers coming into the workplace, they were defined by who they were with. Men were defined by what they did. It still looks that way, but nothing has changed for men. But for women, the dual reality of what you have of your generation is to be defined by what you do and who you're with. And so what I see in those early, especially 60s and early 70s women, they'll start careers. They may start a job, they just go into that section, and then all of a sudden they'll go, I need to be married and having children. Because their past says that's what I'm supposed to do. And this is where you get now the duality of a woman doing both jobs, doing both things. And it was very confusing about that choice.
Well, you feel guilty.
Existed.
There was a guilt. When
Yes.
I'd go on tour and I had to be gone for 2 weeks, we didn't have computers where you could just Skype your child and talk with them. So the guilt I felt on the road, I raised them until they were all in school before I went back to work. But then once I was on the road, you feel torn in half because you're showing them the woman that they can be, but you want to hold them and read them a book at bedtime. So it is very difficult, but it can be done. And I did it.
It's being done, yes. And you talked about divorce with your mom. Divorce became huge around that time in the 70s because if a man was abusive or he was absent in the marriage, a woman could now survive on her own. And the interesting thing is, it's harder for her to survive because her wages are suppressed, there's sexual harassment, confidence is undermined.
It was limited professional options as well.
You're coming into the male world, and the thing is, men have never, ever had to compete with women in their workplace en masse like that.
Right.
And it's 40 years new.
Well, actually, I find this interesting, though, throughout history, because the Rosie the Riveters, the ones during World War II that were in the factories doing the work, when the men came back, they told the women, go back to the kitchen.
Yes.
So the men didn't have to compete with the women, but the women were then conflicted because they knew they could do what the men could do, but they were being told that they weren't able to now. They weren't needed. And so I think even before the boomers being conflicted, you have the greatest generation where the women got a taste of working and being independent of a man and then having the men come back.
And the interesting thing, when they went back in and you saw the boomer women going into the workplace in the 60s, they came in very service positions to men. They were waitresses, secretaries, flight attendants.
Right.
For the image of men, because the flight attendants had to look like models. They were weighed every day. They had the big coiffed beehive blonde hair. And
I know it's terrible, but I kind of miss,
You miss that, okay.
And the nurses and their little white outfits.
I don't think any woman wants to be weighed every day.
Not the weighing part, just the good hair.
Yes.
Good hair.
Big hair.
Big hair. That's so great. No, they, with women going into the workforce, it's changed a lot for men generationally as well. And I think the Gen Xers and the boomer men probably had the hardest time because they're the ones that were trying to keep that from happening. More so probably the boomers because it was new to them. But if younger generations want a good example of what it was like in the 60s, Mad Men would be a good,
I love Mad Men.
Would be a great show for you to Netflix and watch because it really does illustrate pretty accurately of what it was like in the 60s.
I religiously watched Mad Men because it really was it was so beautifully done to the detail of what really was going on in the socialization of men and women at that time. And I look also at, as we saw, your generation, I talked about Pluto being in a sign ruling a generation. Well, for the Gen Xers, Pluto went into Virgo. And Virgo, the synchronicity of what I said earlier, Pluto means roles. What is my role in life? What is my sort of, when you go to your job, that's what I'm doing. I'm supposed to do this. Well, this was the beginning of a dual role for women. And you're also called the latchkey kids.
Yes, I was a latchkey kid as well.
Because as the boomer women came into the workplace and that continued to increase, then the children were left at home.
A lot of single women. There were a lot more single women.
Yeah, a lot of single women. So, that's that generation and still trying to find their place. You're also called the shadow generation because you're in the shadow of the bigger generation of the boomers. Now,
I never felt like I was in the shadows.
Yeah, well, you're not. But what's interesting
I don't think Gen Xers realize that, though. That was
Yeah.
the funny thing about our generation. We were having such a good time with rock and roll and fluorescence and colors.
Well, you had the 80s.
And in the 80s, that we didn't notice that we were being squeezed from both sides.
Yeah.
We didn't know, so it was great. It was great.
Well, and it's funny because the boomers being the big generation, and it's all about us being Leos, the center of attention. We're going into our senior years the same way. We're not
Fighting.
Growing up. It's a
Right.
sign of children. We're still pretending we're kids, you know.
See
and-
the 75-year-olds on the commercials with black leather jackets
Yes.
and motorcycles for senior
Yes.
living?
Yeah, we all
they're
think we're
fighting.
rock and roll stars still.
It's so funny.
And the other thing too is that the Pluto and Leo in the Boomer generation, it rules children. So their children became extensions of themselves. And this is when you got
Yes,
them
that's so true.
coddling their children because of what they didn't get from their parents from the Depression. And they said, I'm never going to have that with my family and my kids. So they overgave.
But boomers being such a big generation, what they did, I think that's different than a lot of generations, they became the parents of Gen X if they had them
Early, yeah.
and the millennials if they had them late.
Absolutely.
And the ones that had them late were the ones carrying the guilt that didn't have a lot of energy to keep up with their kids, and
Right.
they gave them video games.
Yes, yes.
So it's interesting to see the difference between the Gen X kids of boomers and millennials.
Right.
Once you subscribe, click the bell so you know when we're going to go live for our live broadcasts.
And if you wish to have a reading with me, just go to my website at tommcmullan.com, and it gives you all the information you'll need about me and how to contact me.